Hi, everybody. I'm going to do the demonstration here related to animated graphs. It'll be added on our Canvas page as soon as I'm done here. A couple of quick notes. First, anything that I cover in this quick demo is going to be also found in the animated infographics tutorial that's on LinkedIn Learning. And that one, you can use their examples. I've got some examples that I'll share as well. They're listed at the bottom of the notes as zip files, and you can grab them. So hopefully I should be able to get through this without screwing it up too many times, but we'll see what happens. First, what I'd like to do is start with review quickly of importing. So I prepared in an earlier tutorial for LinkedIn Learning animated infographics some, let's see here, a little bar graph, and always going to make sure to choose composition, retain layer sizes, and go ahead and open. This document, if I were to just open up that composition, should have my layers the way that I organized them earlier when I was working in Illustrator. One thing to keep in mind is that anytime you make a new composition or bring something in, it's going to create whatever you make on the same duration as your previous or last composition, last time you were working. So for our purposes, I'm just going to bring this down to about 3 seconds instead of 13 seconds because it doesn't need to be that long. From here, what I would need to do is just go through and just double check my layers to see what I brought in. And in general, it looks like things should work out pretty well. Now, when it comes to animating this kind of content, again, as much as you can prepare ahead outside of your animation software is better, just because the design is easier to manage outside, and then the motion is something that I can manage more easily here. So I've got this layer of some of my lines for my graph. It's kind of labeled goofy. It used to be black, now it's blue. And what I'm going to do is go under Layer, Create Shapes from Vector Layer. This is the way that I can convert from an Illustrator layer to a shape layer. And that's what's going to give me the ability to animate. Now, all of those little bars were in the same layer. I could have separated things out a little bit more, but keep in mind that when we create a shape layer, it will also create each of those vector shapes as a sublayer. So I have two places that I can control it. I can control it as the whole group, and then I can go into an individual bar and animate those independently. And as far as that's concerned, when it comes to animating these onto or off of the frame, I can choose a number of different ways of working, one of which would be to choose the path, and then by holding Shift and clicking, I can drop certain anchor points and that kind of thing. And then if I wanted to animate this onto the frame, in this case, I'm holding Shift to just drag it down to the beginning. Probably I should have keyframed that first. So I'm going to go ahead in my timeline. I'm going to activate keyframes for that path. I'm going to drop the selection on the bottom and hold Shift to grab it on the top. And then I'm going to go back in time and I'm going to drag this down holding Shift so that it goes in a straight line. So in just a couple of steps, I can animate that line onto the frame. Now, probably this should be spaced out. I could add easing. I could maybe have some overshoot, like maybe here it's going to go past my end value and then come back to settle down onto it. So it's going to shoot up and then come down, and I can keep going from there. So this is just a really fast example, but you can see with just keyframing the path of something inside of a shape layer, I could get quite a bit done in terms of creating this little animated bar graph. So I would just keep doing the same thing over and over again, block in my animations, and then come back and refine them once I see what's going on and how things look. Now, step 2 from that would be to make a little bit more complicated bar graph, and that would be to maybe start with something that I want to look three-dimensional. I could have made this outside in Illustrator, but to save time, I'll just do it really quickly here using the pen tool. And I turned on the guide for grids so that I can use that as a starting point or as a way to make sure that I'm drawing straight lines. So I'm going to start adding a shape layer, and I'm holding shift so that I go in straight lines, and I'm following my grid, and I'm closing off my path. So this one now, if I wanted to animate it, would more or less work the same way. But let's say I want to make it look like it's a little bit more three-dimensional. So my next step maybe would be to drop that selection, grab my pen tool again so that I'm not creating a mask, and then maybe choose a darker color that will serve a little bit like a shadow. And again, I'm just going to follow my grid and create another side. Then I'm going to do the same thing again and make sure to drop that shape. And then I'm going to add another one. In this case, maybe I need it to be even lighter since it's on the top. And in this case, I'm going to follow my grid again, creating my next shape. And if I follow that grid, I should be able to get something that will look close to the right perspective. Again, probably a better solution would be to draw this kind of shape outside in Illustrator or Photoshop, where I can design that three-dimensional object to look a little bit more accurate. But in any case, if I were to continue with the same approach as I did with the more traditional two-dimensional bar graph here, I would come into the contents of that shape layer. I would go into my shape, and I would go into the path again, and I would start by animating some of the same elements. So I'm going to grab those corners again. Oops. Make sure that I have my path at the end point animated or keyframed. Then again, working back to the beginning, just grab those two edges, holding shift, and then drag it down. So now I've got my bar graph growing up. In order to get the other shapes to follow, I'm going to want to leave this one a little bit open. So I'm going to use the shortcut key for U so that only the things that are keyframed are visible. And then I'm going to come into the other shape, which is the second one that I drew. And I'm going to use the keyframe advance from my first shape. And then I'm going to, again, use U so that I can just only have those two visible. That's my end, and here's my beginning. So I can grab my shape and, again, holding shift, draw it down to the bottom to make it look like it's gone. And those two now are growing up or drawing onto the frame together. And finally, this last one, if I were to animate it, I would need to go down to its endpoint, go to its path, then use my frame advance or my keyframe advance to put my last end keyframe, and then I'll go back to that beginning. And in this case, I don't need to change its shape all that much. I could quite literally drag that path down, or yes, grab its path and just holding shift, make sure that I line up with my other elements. if I turn off that grid, I didn't get perfect lines up everything, but it's pretty darn close, and it draws on. So that would be, again, similar process to just animating a two-dimensional bar graph, but in this case, just more shapes to handle. And if I were to add some easing or some overshoot or some of the other secondary animations that we've talked about this semester, I could get some really great stuff to happen. The next one that I want to show is a little bit more complicated. And so I won't walk through all of the process, but you can get some examples related to this on the assigned tutorials on LinkedIn, Animated Infographics, to get more detail or a more, I guess, clear version of the process. So I'm grabbing my ellipse tool and I'm going to just double click so that I have a centered circle. And what I'm going to be doing with this is first adjusting the shape of that ellipse to be a circle instead of the size of the composition ellipse. Then I'm going to add an effect called radial wipe, which will only work if this is centered in the frame or in the composition, and it will give me a transition completion to go all the way around. And then as I add in other pies to the chart, I will create a null object to control that transition, and then I will parent them together using the pick whip. So that's kind of a quick overview of the process, but in order to show you that in a relatively short amount of time, I'm going to go back to my shape layer again and give it a circular size. And then I'm going to go into my effects panel, and I'm going to look for the transition radial wipe. Yes, transition radial wipe, and I add that on. And now just really quickly so you can see what that transition does is it will wipe it on or off the frame going from 0 to 100. So it does a percentage. You can also change it from clockwise to counterclockwise. Maybe that's going to be more effective, so it looks like it's, who knows. In any case, from this point on, what I want is to not have to keyframe this individually, although I could. If I'm going to have more than one pie, I probably want to be able to control them in one place. So this strategy is similar to parenting, but I'll just show you really quickly what it will look like. I'm going to go up under Layer, New, Null Object. And if you haven't used a null object yet this semester, this would be a good time to mess around with it. The null object is really like a control. So it doesn't really have anything that it's doing until I start to connect things to it or add effects. You could also think about it like making a group. So I can control multiple layers with the null object. And for that null object, I'm going to need something called a slider control. So I'm using the null as a transition completion control object. And what it's going to have is a slider that's going from 0 to 45 or to 100 or whatever I need for my pie. And then at that point, what I'm going to need to do is come into the radial wipe effect. So let me just drag this up so we can see it a little bit better. And I want to connect the pick whip, which is the way that I create a expression on the fly by just sort of dragging it up to something. But I want to make sure that I also have my slider control visible. So I'll go down to that transition completion. I grab that little squiggly and I drag it over to slider control. It didn't work. What happened? I have to actually drag it right to the thing that can be keyframed. So basically it's like you're connecting the dots between one keyframeable element to another one. So I'm drag it over there and now it connects. My transition completion is now red, which tells me on the fly that it's being controlled through an expression. And if I open that up, you can see that the expression is really just describing that this element is being controlled by something else. And it tells you exactly where it is, but at that point, I don't really need to do anything with that. So now if I were to keyframe that slider, let's say I'm going to go from 0 . So I add my keyframe. Actually, I want that to be 100. And then I want to draw it on to, let's say, 50. So that'll give me my 50% of the pie. If I wanted to keep working, what I would do is probably have more than one piece of pie in a pie chart. So I'm going to add an additional slider control. I'm going to create some additional shape layers, which are literally just a duplicate of this, maybe a different fill color so that I could see the difference between them. And then I would continue to connect the dots and create a slider control so that this null object then becomes the element that I'm using to control all of the pie. And this is the one that would have all the keyframes. So in the interest of not making crazy long video demonstrations for you guys, there are the resources available for you on our site, and I'll show you where to get that zip and what it looks like. But this one is one that I did a little bit more work with in order to do the three-dimensional bar graph sort of thing, and because this is what will be in the file that you grab, the zip. If you were to open it up, you will be able to see exactly what I'm keyframing for each of these. So the difference in this one than what I did earlier was that I made multiple shapes inside of one shape layer. So that's really the only difference, but keyframing and everything else is more or less the same. When it comes to the pie chart, this one again also is a little bit more detailed, but you can see I just have 3 little pie wedges and then one control. That control has 3 sliders, and the 3 sliders are connected to the transition completion of each of these. And there's a little bit of math in there that I did in order to get them to average out, but I can get a little wipe transition to make my my pie chart sort of like rotate out. So just to wrap things up again really quickly, there's a After Effects project file with those 2 examples. So the bar graph and the pie chart, and then also just keep in mind that the After Effects Guru Animated Infographics covers this exact same information in Chapter 2. The one I didn't get to is the line graph. I'll just make another short video for that, and I'll share that as well. So that should hopefully help us get halfway started with thinking about how to animate data or information in a way that might be a little bit more interesting than just a slideshow with still images. Thanks.